The great hall of Valdremore's council smelled of melting candle wax, pine resin burning in the torches, and the thick fragrance of red wine spilling from the nobles' cups. It was the night of the Alliance banquet, the most important event of the year in the kingdom. The only occasion when the 4 packs of the northern lands gathered beneath the same stone roof to renew their vows of peace and sit together at the long table. Lily arrived through the servants' entrance. There was no other way in for her. Daughter of a dead blacksmith and a healer who had left too soon, Lily had grown up in the village of Ashven, 3 days' ride from Valdremore's castle. She was 23 years old, with golden hair braided down her spine like ripened wheat, eyes the color of the sky before rain, and cheeks always faintly flushed from the heat of the hearths, where she spent hours cooking for the innkeeper Lord Borin. It had been Borin himself who sent her to the castle. The king's head cook collapsed with fever this afternoon. He had said in that hoarse voice of someone who always speaks louder than necessary, "You'll go in my place. You cook better than any man I know, Lily. Don't embarrass me." She was not there to avoid embarrassing Borin. She was there because she had no choice. Because she owed 3 months of rent on the small house she shared with her friend Senna. And because Borin had promised to pay the entire debt if she returned with the king's praise. The king's praise. Lily repeated that phrase inside her head as she walked down the cold stone corridors leading to the underground kitchens, carrying her linen apron and the small basket where she kept her own seasonings, dried herbs she grew herself, mountain rosemary, black thyme, anchor root, and a few wild lavender blossoms that gave her broths a sweetness no one could ever identify, but everyone always wanted more of. The kitchen was chaos. 3 assistants ran between steaming pots. 2 young men argued over control of the spit where a massive boar was roasting. And a middle-aged woman with grease on her hands and panic in her eyes, the undercook Dora, turned to face Lily as though she were staring at salvation itself. "You're the one Borin sent?" she asked, looking her up and down with distrust. "You seem too young." "I'm 23, Lily replied calmly, tying her apron without losing a moment. "How long until the banquet begins?" "1 hour. Lily looked at the pots, at the boar on the spit, at the trays of poorly seasoned vegetables, at the broth that had boiled far too long and lost its color. She breathed in slowly. She smelled each thing, not just with her nose, but with that deeper sense she had never quite been able to explain, that instinct which told her what every dish needed before she even touched it. "I need stone salt, goat butter, red wine from the barrel at the back, and 3 handfuls of fresh garlic," she said, with the same calm of someone asking for directions. "And someone needs to hold that spit straight. The boar is going to burn on the left side if it keeps turning like that." Dora blinked. Then she stepped aside and let Lily work. Upstairs, the banquet hall glowed. Torches along the walls cast golden light over the banners of the 4 packs. The Black Wolf of Valdremore, the Golden Stag of Arenfell, the Silver Raven of Stonemarch, and the Grey Lion of Duskwall. The long oak tables were covered with silver cups, fresh bread, and wild flowers hastily gathered by the servants. And at the center of it all, in the highest chair, seated as though the throne were simply a seat he had decided to occupy out of convenience, sat Alpha King Xander of Valdremore. He was not what Lily had imagined, and she would never have admitted she had imagined anything at all. His black hair fell in firm braids over broad shoulders draped in a dark fur mantle. His eyes were a blue so deep they seemed to hold something beyond color, like dark water that does not reflect the sky but keeps its own depths. A thin scar ran from the right corner of his jaw almost to his neck, and he wore it the way a man wears a signature, not a bad memory. He wore black leather armor with crossed straps over his chest, not the ceremonial armor a common king would choose for a banquet, but the armor of a man who does not trust the world enough to take it off even while eating. To his right, Lord Edric of Arenfell rambled on about harvests and borders. To his left, Lord Cale of Stonemarch watched the room with the eyes of someone calculating the value of everything in it. Xander listened, or pretended to listen. His gaze moved through the hall with the precision of a wolf who never entirely stops watching, even when he appears to be at rest. "My king," said a servant, bowing close to his ear. "The head cook has fallen ill. A cook was sent from Ashfen to replace him tonight." Xander did not answer immediately. He drank a slow sip of wine. "If the food is unworthy of the banquet," he said at last, in that low voice his warriors knew as the warning that comes before the storm, "bring me whoever cooked it." Personally, the servant swallowed and bowed again before disappearing into the crowd. The first tray arrived at the table 32 minutes later. It was a boar bone broth with anchor roots, black thyme, and a thread of wild honey, served in warmed clay bowls with thin slices of rye bread alongside. Simple. Completely simple for a royal banquet. Lord Edric looked at the bowl with one eyebrow raised. "Broth," he murmured, as though the word itself had an unpleasant taste. Xander said nothing. He brought the spoon to his lips. The silence that followed lasted only 2 seconds, but it was the kind of silence everyone at the table noticed without being able to explain why. The king's eyes dropped to the bowl with an expression that was not quite surprise. It was something closer to recognition. As though he had forgotten the taste of something important and suddenly remembered it. "Who cooked this?" he asked. His voice was low, calm, but the nearby servants straightened their shoulders. "The cook sent from Ashfen, my king, a young woman named Lily." Xander did not reply. He served himself more broth. The second dish was the roasted boar, this time with a perfect crust, tender inside, seasoned with mountain rosemary and a garlic and butter paste that had seeped into the meat during the final stretch of fire. Around the boar lay roasted vegetables with herbs and a red wine reduction that gleamed like amber over the wooden serving board. Lord Cale of Stonemarch, who rarely made comments about food, stopped speaking mid-sentence about border agreements and stared at his plate. "This," he said with genuine astonishment, "is extraordinary." Laughter and murmurs of agreement rippled down the table. Xander ate in silence. But he ate with an attention he rarely gave to anything that was not a battle map or a threat to the kingdom. Every flavor seemed to have been considered not merely to please, but to tell a story. The broth warmed from within before the boar arrived, which was rich without being heavy. The wine reduction balanced the salt of the meat. The herbs appeared and faded like notes in a song he had not known he remembered. When the third dish arrived, a sweet bread with wild honey and toasted walnuts, served alongside warm spiced wine with clove and dried orange peel, Xander set his cup on the table with deliberate care. "I want to see her," he said. Lily was washing the last of the pots when the servant came down the stairs with a face as white as chalk. "The king wants to see you," he said. "Now." She dried her hands on her apron. Her heart beat harder once, only once, before settling again. She had done her work. The food was good. She knew it was good. What could a king possibly want from her beyond that? Senna always said that Lily had a strange calm for someone who had so little, that she faced the world with that quiet gaze, as though she knew, somewhere deep down, that things would work out, even when there was no evidence of it. Lily climbed the stone stairs with her apron still tied, her braids slightly loosened by the heat of the hearths, and a small broth stain on her right wrist. She entered the banquet hall through the side door, and found Xander's blue eyes waiting for her from across the room, as though he had known exactly which door she would come through. The hall did not go quiet all at once. It faded, the way a fire dims when someone opens a window, not extinguished, but suddenly aware of something colder entering the room. Conversations slowed. Cups paused halfway to lips. Noble heads turned toward the side door where a young woman in a linen apron stood with a broth stain on her wrist and a loosened braid over her shoulder. Lily did not shrink. She had expected to feel smaller in a room like this. All that stone and candlelight and the weight of titles pressing down from every carved banner on the wall. But something in her feet refused to retreat, and something in her spine refused to curve. And so she simply stood in the doorway and met the gaze of the man at the head of the table, the same way she met every difficult thing in her life, directly and without flinching. Xander studied her. He did not do it quickly. He did it the way he studied a map before a campaign, thoroughly, without hurry, cataloging every detail as though each one mattered. The apron, the braid, the stain on her wrist. The way she held her hands loosely at her sides rather than clasped in the nervous knot most servants twisted their fingers into when summoned before him. The color in her cheeks. Not embarrassment, he decided. Heat from the hearth. There was a difference, and he noticed it. He rose from his chair. The room responded to this the way a room always responded when Xander stood. A collective stillness, a held breath, a subtle repositioning of every person present, as though the air itself had shifted its center of gravity. He was not the tallest man in the hall, but he was the one the hall organized itself around, and everyone felt it even when they could not name it. He stepped around the table and crossed the hall toward her. Lily counted his steps without meaning to. 7. He stopped 3 feet away, which was closer than she had expected and farther than she had feared. He was larger up close, not in the exaggerated way of men who needed their size to speak for them, but in the way of someone built for endurance, wide through the shoulders, steady in the stance, with hands that had clearly held both a sword and something heavier than a sword at some point, and knew the difference between the two. The scar along his jaw caught the torchlight at this distance, and she could see it was older than it looked from across the room. His eyes were still blue. Impossibly, distractingly blue. "You cooked tonight's meal," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, my king," she answered. Her voice came out steadier than she had any right to expect. "The broth." He said it the same way someone names something they have been trying to remember for a long time. What was in it? Boar bone, simmered for 4 hours with anchor root and black thyme. Wild honey near the end, just before serving, and a small piece of dried orange peel removed before the bowls were filled. A pause. "Orange peel," he repeated. "It softens the bitterness of the anchor root, my king. Without it, the root dominates. With it, everything settles." Something shifted in his expression. Not a smile, not exactly, but a loosening around the eyes that suggested he was recalibrating something he had assumed about this conversation. "Where did you learn that?" "My mother," Lily said simply. "She was a healer. She taught me that every ingredient has a nature, and cooking is just learning how to let each one be what it is without fighting the others." The hall had gone very quiet now. Not the restless quiet of people pretending not to listen. The genuine quiet of people who have forgotten to pretend. Lord Edric cleared his throat from the table. Lord Cale did not bother. Xander held her gaze for a moment longer, then looked at the man standing to his right. A broad-shouldered warrior with copper-red hair, and the kind of grin that suggested he found almost everything, at least mildly entertaining. This was Gareth, the king's second in command, and the closest thing Xander had to someone he tolerated long enough to call a friend. Gareth raised both eyebrows at his king, with an expression that said, clearly and without words, "Well, this is interesting." Xander turned back to Lily. "You came from Ashfin." "Yes, my king." "Boren's Inn." "Yes. And before tonight, you cooked only for an inn." There was no judgment in his voice. He was assembling facts, not delivering a verdict. But Lily felt the shape of the question underneath the question, the unspoken how, and answered it honestly. "I cooked for whoever needed feeding, my king. Travelers, merchants, shepherds passing through. Sometimes a sick neighbor, sometimes no one at all, and I cooked anyway, because the work itself helps me think." Another pause. Longer this time. "It helps you think," he said slowly, as though tasting the phrase the way he had tasted the broth. "Yes." She held his gaze. "I imagine it is the same for some men with a sword." Gareth made a sound behind Xander that he converted quickly and unconvincingly into a cough. Xander did not look at him. His eyes stayed on Lily with that same unrushed attention. and for a moment she had the strange and unsettling feeling that he was not just looking at her, but reading something written in a language he had almost forgotten he knew. "You'll stay," he said. Lily blinked. "My king?" "In the castle. You'll cook for the duration of the council. 3 days." Her voice caught slightly. She recovered it. "I was sent for 1 evening, my king. Boren expects me to return by— I'll send word to Boren." He said it without breaking her gaze, as though the matter of Boren's expectations were a minor administrative detail, which, from where he stood, it probably was. "You'll be given a room in the east corridor, access to the full kitchens, and whatever provisions you require. Name them to Dora and she'll arrange it." Lily stared at him. He stared back. "That is," she began carefully, "a generous offer, my king." "It is not an offer," he said, and his voice was not unkind, but it was absolute in the way that things said by men who have never needed to say anything twice tend to be absolute. "It is a decision. You may rest now. The kitchens will be yours from dawn." He turned and walked back to his chair with the same unhurried certainty with which he had crossed the room, and the hall slowly exhaled around him, and conversations resumed, and cups were lifted again. And Lord Edric began talking about something involving grain taxes that no one was particularly interested in. Lily stood in the doorway for 1 moment longer. Gareth caught her eye from across the room and gave her the smallest nod, the kind that meant you handled that well, before turning back to fill his cup. She walked back to the servants' corridor. Her hands were still steady. Her heart, however, had not entirely decided what it thought about the last 10 minutes. The room she was given in the east corridor was small, but clean. A stone chamber with a narrow bed, a wool blanket in deep green, a wooden table, a candle in a clay holder, and a window that looked out over the courtyard where 2 young guards trained with wooden swords in the blue light of the early night. Lily sat on the edge of the bed and did not unpack her basket. She thought about Senna, who would be waiting for her at the house in Ashvin with cold tea and 100 questions. She thought about Boren, who would receive the king's message with a mix of pride and complaint that she knew by heart already. She thought about 3 days in the castle kitchens with access to provisions she had never had, spices from the southern roots, aged wines from the castle cellars, cuts of meat that would have cost her a month's wages at the market. She thought about Xander's eyes, the way they had not moved from her face even once during the entire conversation. The way he spoke, not with cruelty, not with arrogance, but with a directness that reminded her, strangely, of the way good ingredients worked. No excess, no performance, just the thing itself. It is not an offer. It is a decision. She almost smiled at that. Almost. She lay down on the narrow bed without removing her boots, and stared at the stone ceiling until the candle burned low. And somewhere above her in the castle, in a chamber she had never seen and would not be invited to, the Alpha King of Valdremore sat at his own table in the dark and thought about orange peel and anchor root and the strange calm in the eyes of a girl from Ashvin who cooked like someone who understood that every ingredient has a nature. He had not tasted a meal like that since before his mother died. He had not expected to think about his mother tonight. He had not expected much of anything tonight, which was perhaps why the evening had unsettled him in a way that no border dispute or rival pack or political negotiation had managed in years. He picked up his wine, set it back down without drinking. Outside, the wind moved through the pines that surrounded Valdremore's walls, carrying the scent of earth and cold stone and, faintly, from somewhere far below, the last warmth of herbs and honey rising from the kitchen hearths. He recognized the scent. He had been recognizing it, he realized, since the moment she entered the hall. Dawn came to Valdremore like a slow decision, gray light pressing through the arrow slits in the stone walls, torches guttering out one by one as the night watch handed the corridors back to the morning. The courtyard filled with the sounds of horses being fed, wood being split, and the low voices of servants carrying water from the well. Lily was already in the kitchen. She had been there since before the light, moving through the space the way she moved through any unfamiliar kitchen. Slowly at first, opening every cupboard, lifting every lid, running her fingers along the shelves of dried herbs and pressing her palm to the surface of the stone hearths to feel which burned hottest and which held heat longest. A kitchen was a language, and she had always been able to read one quickly. This kitchen was extraordinary. Provisions she had only heard travelers describe at Boren's Inn were stacked and hanging, and stored in cool alcoves throughout the space. Saffron wrapped in cloth from the southern markets, oak smoked salt from the coast, dried mushrooms from the forest highlands that smelled of earth and rain even through the cloth bags, honeycomb still in the wax, butter churned so fresh it had not yet fully solidified, cuts of venison, pheasant, river fish packed in salt, root vegetables she had grown herself in smaller, humbler versions for years, here in sizes that made her own garden feel like a sketch compared to a painting. Dora arrived an hour after Lily and stopped in the doorway. Lily had already reorganized half the larder, started a stock from the venison bones, and was currently debating, in complete silence and with great seriousness, between two varieties of dried sage. "You came early," Dora said. "The stock needs 4 hours minimum," Lily replied, setting down one of the sage bundles and choosing the other. "If I want it ready for the midday meal, I couldn't afford to sleep much longer." Dora watched her for a moment with the particular expression of someone reassessing an opinion they had formed too quickly. "What are you planning?" she asked. "Venison broth to start, then a slow-roasted pheasant with root vegetables and a reduction of the castle's aged red wine. And bread. Proper bread, not the decorative kind. The kind that still has warmth in it when it reaches the table. The king doesn't typically eat a midday meal with the council. He takes it in his study." Lily paused. "Alone?" "With Gareth, usually. Sometimes the castle steward. He doesn't like ceremony around his midday meal. Says it slows the afternoon." "Then the midday meal is more important than the banquet," Lily said, almost to herself, turning back to the stock. "A man eats differently when no one is watching. You learn what he actually needs, rather than what the occasion demands." Dora was quiet for a long moment. "I'll have the kitchen boys bring you more wood for the far hearth," she said finally. "It burns steadiest for roasting." It was, Lily understood, the closest Dora was going to come to saying, "I think I was wrong about you." She accepted it the same way she accepted most things. Quietly, and without making it larger than it needed to be. The tray arrived at Xander's study just before midday. He heard the knock, said nothing, and the door opened anyway, which meant it was Gareth, who was the only person in the castle who interpreted the king's silence as an invitation rather than a warning. "The cook sent lunch," Gareth announced, setting the tray on the edge of the large oak table that served as Xander's desk, currently buried under maps, trade records, and a letter from the eastern border that had arrived 3 days ago and still hadn't been answered. Xander did not look up from the map he was studying. "Put it there. It's already there." Gareth dropped into the chair across from him, with the ease of someone who had long since stopped waiting to be invited to sit. "Also, I think you should know that half the castle staff have already decided they're in love with her." A pause. "With the cook," Gareth clarified, in case there was any ambiguity, which there wasn't. "They fall in love with anyone who feeds them well," Xander said, without looking up. "That's true, but this is different." Dora reorganized the entire morning schedule to give her access to the good hearths first. "Dora, Xander. The woman who told your previous head cook that his roast pheasant tasted like regret." Xander looked up. Gareth gestured at the tray with both hands as though presenting evidence. The bowl of venison broth was deep amber, clear and rich, with thin slices of root vegetable and a single sprig of fresh thyme floating at the surface. Beside it, half a small loaf of dark bread, still faintly steaming through the cloth it was wrapped in. And next to that, a small dish of butter worked with herbs. Something that had not been requested, had not been on any instruction, and had simply appeared because whoever made it had considered that bread without good butter was an incomplete thought. Xander looked at the tray for a moment. Then he moved the map aside and sat down properly. Gareth watched him take the first spoonful of broth with the focused attention of a man who has been waiting to see someone's reaction to something for quite some time. The reaction was subtle. It always was with Xander. a slight slowing of movement, a stillness around the eyes, the particular quality of silence that meant something had landed. "She knows," Xander said quietly after a moment. "Knows what?" "That the midday meal is different from the banquet." He broke a piece of bread slowly. "This is not a performance. This is food that was made to be eaten by a person, not food made to be admired by a hall." Gareth considered this. Most cooks don't think about that distinction. "Most cooks are cooking for the hall," Xander said. "She cooked for me." The word sat between them with a weight that Gareth chose, wisely, not to examine out loud. Instead, he reached for the bread, received a look from Xander that communicated clearly that the bread had not been sent for Gareth, and withdrew his hand. "There's something else," Gareth said, settling back into the chair. "Cale of Stonemarch sent a message this morning. He wants to extend his stay by 2 days. He never extends his stay. He never had a reason to before. He specifically mentioned, and I am reading this directly so you understand I am not embellishing, the singular quality of the castle's hospitality, which has improved markedly since last evening." Xander said nothing. "He means the food," Gareth added. I understood what he meant. Edric of Ehrenfell also mentioned at breakfast that he hadn't slept so well after a meal since his wedding feast, which, given that his wife has the personality of a border dispute, is saying something. Xander finished the broth and began on the pheasant that arrived minutes later, roasted to exactly the right depth, the skin crisp and darkened with a patience that most cooks did not have. The meat beneath pulling away from the bone with the slight resistance that meant it had been cooked through completely without losing its moisture. The wine reduction pooled beneath it, dark and slightly sweet, and the root vegetables had been left in large pieces rather than cut small, which meant they still held their individual character rather than melting into sameness. He ate the entire thing. He could not remember the last time he had eaten an entire midday meal. Lily did not see the king until late afternoon, and it happened by accident. She had gone to the castle garden to gather fresh herbs. The kitchen stores had dried versions of everything, but she had spotted, from the kitchen window, a small walled garden on the south side of the castle, where rosemary and thyme grew in long untended rows, clearly planted with intention at some point, and then largely forgotten. She had asked one of the kitchen boys if she was permitted to use it, and he had shrugged in a way that meant he had no idea, but wasn't going to stop her. She was crouching between 2 rows of rosemary, cutting stems with the small knife she kept in her basket, when she heard footsteps on the garden path behind her. She knew before she turned. She wasn't sure how. The footsteps were not loud. In fact, they were remarkably quiet for a man of that size, which said something about the kind of awareness he carried in his body, even when he wasn't trying. But something in the air shifted, and she knew, and she stood and turned before he rounded the corner. Xander stopped when he saw her. He was alone, which surprised her. No Gareth, no guards trailing at a respectful distance. Just the King of Valdremore in the narrow, walled garden with his braids slightly loosened from the day and his fur mantle absent, wearing only the leather armor and the expression of a man who had come here to be somewhere without anyone in it. They looked at each other across 10 feet of garden path. "I didn't know anyone used this garden," he said. "I didn't think anyone would mind," she replied. Then added, "My king." He looked at the rosemary in her hand, then at the basket, then back at her face with that unhurried attention that she was beginning to understand was simply how he looked at things. Not an assessment, not a judgment, just the genuine focus of someone who considered the world worth paying attention to. "The midday meal," he said. She waited. "It was the best meal I have eaten in this castle since I was a child," he said. Simply, as though the statement required no ornamentation. Something in Lily's chest did a thing she chose not to examine too closely. "I'm glad it was to your liking, my king." "It was not a matter of liking," he said, and his voice was the same as it had been in the hall, low, unhurried, direct. "Liking is for things that please you. That meal was something different. It was..." He paused. searching for the word with a patience that suggested he took language as seriously as he took maps. Restorative. Lily looked at him for a moment. "My mother used to say," she said carefully, "that a good meal doesn't fill you. It reminds you that you are alive." The garden was very quiet. The wind moved through the rosemary around them and carried the scent of it upward into the pale afternoon light. And somewhere beyond the castle walls, a raven called once and went silent. Xander held her gaze with those impossible blue eyes, and Lily had the clear and certain feeling that something was being decided in this silence. Something that had nothing to do with kitchens or councils or 3-day stays. She did not know yet what it was, but she did not look away. The second day of the council brought rain. It arrived before sunrise, quiet at first, a fine mist that softened the edges of the castle's stone towers and turned the courtyard cobblestones dark and gleaming. By mid-morning, it had deepened into a steady pour that drummed against the arrow slits and filled the corridors with the smell of wet earth and cold iron. Lily found that she cooked differently in the rain. It was something she had noticed years ago in Ashfen, that gray skies called for different things than clear ones, that cold air wanted depth and warmth in a way that summer never did. She moved through the kitchen that morning with a particular sense of purpose, adjusting the day's plan without having been asked to, trusting the instinct that had never failed her. She set 3 large pots on the hottest hearths. The first was a root and barley soup, thick, slow, built on the venison stock from the previous day, with added turnip, parsnip, and the smoked salt from the coast that dissolved into the liquid like a whispered secret, deepening everything without announcing itself. The second was a spiced mulled wine, reduced by a third and sweetened with the castle's honeycomb, meant to sit in a warming pot on the council table throughout the afternoon session. The third was something she had not originally planned, a slow bread pudding with dried fruit, dark honey, and a crust of crushed walnuts for the evening, because rain evenings called for something that felt like an embrace. Dora stood in the kitchen doorway watching her work with an expression that had fully crossed the line from cautious assessment into unguarded admiration. "You changed the whole menu," Dora said. "The weather changed," Lily replied, not looking up from the soup she was stirring. "The menu follows. The king approved a menu yesterday. The king approved a menu for yesterday's weather." She tasted the soup, added a pinch of smoked salt, tasted again. "If he objects, I'll explain. But I don't think he will." Dora made a sound that was almost a laugh, a short, surprised thing, quickly suppressed, as though she had forgotten she was capable of it. She did not object either. The council session ran long. Lily knew because the kitchen boy who carried the warming pot of spiced wine to the council chamber came back twice to have it refilled, and each time he returned with the particular look of someone who had been in a room where the atmosphere was heavier than usual. The careful eyes, the slightly quickened step, the relief of re-entering the kitchen. "What are they discussing?" Dora asked the boy on his second return. "The eastern border," he said, setting down the pot. "Lord Cale wants more guards stationed at the Stone March crossing. Lord Edric says the cost should be shared between all 4 packs. The king hasn't said much." "When the king hasn't said much, it means he has already decided," Dora said, almost to herself. Lily said nothing. She was plating the soup, arranging the bread alongside it. Dark rye with a thick crust, baked that morning with the ash salt that gave it a faint mineral depth she was particularly pleased with. She worked steadily and without hurry, and if she was thinking about anything beyond the food in front of her, she gave no outward sign of it. But she had been thinking. Since the garden. Since the quiet that had stretched between them and the rosemary rose like something living. A good meal doesn't fill you. It reminds you that you are alive. He had looked at her when she said it the way people sometimes looked at a thing they recognized without knowing where they had seen it before. Not surprise. Not sentiment. Something older and quieter than either. She had replayed that look more times than she intended to. The soup arrived at the council chamber during a pause in the discussion, and Lily carried it herself this time. Not because it was her role, but because Dora had sent 2 kitchen boys ahead with the bread and wine, and someone needed to bring the pot. and Lily had not wanted to hand it to someone who might tilt it on the stairs. That was what she told herself. She entered the chamber through the side door, set the pot on the serving table near the wall, and began ladling the soup into the waiting bowls without looking up, a skill she had developed over years at Boren's Inn, the ability to be present in a room without inserting herself into it. She was on the third bowl when she became aware that the conversation had paused. She continued ladling. "That smell," said Lord Cale of Stonmarch, in the tone of a man who has just been interrupted mid-thought by something more interesting than his own thoughts. "What is that?" "Root and barley soup, my lord," Lily said, still not looking up. "With smoked salt and the remnants of yesterday's venison stock." "It smells like the Stonemarch Highlands," Cale said, with something close to wonder in his voice. "Like the peat fires in autumn." "The smoked salt is from the coastal settlements near the Highland border," Lily said. "The smoke comes from peat-dried wood. It carries the memory of the place it came from." A silence. She finally looked up and found 5 men watching her. Lord Cale with open curiosity, Lord Edric with a politely raised eyebrow, 2 council advisors with identical expressions of mild bewilderment, and Xander at the head of the table with his hands resting flat on the wood and his blue eyes on her face with that precise, unmoving attention she was beginning to know the shape of. "Leave a bowl for the king," Gareth said cheerfully from his seat to Xander's right, breaking the silence with his usual practical efficiency. Lily set the last bowl in front of Xander without meeting his eyes, turned to go, and heard his voice behind her. "Stay." She turned back slowly. The council members were applying themselves to their soup with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Lord Cale with something approaching reverence, Lord Edric with careful, considered appreciation. Gareth had already finished half of his, and was clearly considering whether it would be inappropriate to ask for more. Xander had not touched his yet. "Sit," he said, and gestured to an empty chair near the end of the table. Not among the lords, but not outside the room either. A position that was neither servant nor noble, which was, she was beginning to understand, the only position he seemed to think was accurate for her. She sat. He watched her for a moment, then looked at his bowl. "Tell me about Ashvin," he said. It was unexpected enough that she took a moment to answer. "What would you like to know, my king?" "Whatever you think matters." She considered this seriously, the way she considered most things. "It is a small village," she said at last. 300 souls, maybe fewer now. Good soil but dry summers. The harvests have been thin for the last 4 years. The river runs clean but low by August. The people are... She paused, searching for the right word. Enduring. They endure well. "You say that with respect," Xander observed. "Endurance is undervalued," she said. "It requires more courage than most people realize. Anyone can be brave once. Enduring asks you to be brave every ordinary day." Lord Edric set down his spoon and looked at her with the expression of a man who has just heard something he intends to repeat later, as though he thought of it himself. Xander said nothing. But something behind his eyes shifted, a subtle deepening, like light-changing quality in a room when a cloud passes. "The village is in my territory," he said. "Yes, my king. I have not visited it in 4 years." Lily held his gaze. "The people would not say so to your face, my king. But the dry summers have been hard. Boren's Inn is the only business still running at full capacity because travelers still need to eat. Most others have quietly reduced." The room was very still. Lord Cale was watching Xander. Gareth had stopped eating. The council advisors had exchanged a glance that they quickly smoothed away. Xander held her gaze for a long moment with an expression she could not fully read, something between responsibility and the particular discomfort of a man who has been handed a truth he cannot argue with. "I will send a surveyor after the council concludes," he said finally. "That would be..." She chose her word carefully. "Welcome, my king." He nodded once, then looked at his soup and finally lifted the spoon. The conversation resumed around the table, quieter than before, with a different texture to it, as though the room had been gently reorganized by something that had nothing to do with border agreements. That evening, after the supper dishes had been cleared and the kitchen fires banked for the night, Lily sat alone in the small walled garden with her cloak pulled around her shoulders and a cup of the leftover spiced wine warming her hands. The rain had eased to a fine mist again. She heard him before she saw him. Those quiet footsteps on the stone path that she had already learned to recognize without knowing when exactly she had started listening for them. Xander appeared at the garden entrance and stopped when he saw her, the same way he had stopped the day before. As though she were an element of the garden he hadn't accounted for but found he did not want to remove. He did not speak immediately. He stepped into the garden and stood near the wall, looking up at the misted sky with the expression of a man who rarely permitted himself to simply stand somewhere without a reason. "The bread pudding," he said finally, without looking at her. "At supper." "Yes?" "My mother made something similar, when I was young." Before, he stopped. Lily did not fill the silence. She had learned, in years of cooking for strangers, that some silences needed to be left whole. "I had forgotten," he said, "what it tasted like." She looked at him, the hard line of his jaw, the scar catching the faint light, the stillness of a man who carried considerable weight and had learned to carry it without letting it show in his posture. "Sometimes," she said gently, "a flavor remembers things for you that you didn't know you were still holding." He looked at her then, directly, with those blue eyes that did not perform anything, that simply looked, the way only very honest people or very dangerous people looked, and she was increasingly certain he was both. "You are not what I expected," he said. "You expected a cook," she said. "I expected someone who could follow a recipe," he said. "That is not what you are." The mist moved through the garden around them, soft and cold, carrying the scent of wet rosemary and stone. "What am I, then?" she asked, and her voice was quiet but not afraid. He held her gaze for a long moment, and something in his expression did what she had not seen it do before. It opened, very slightly the way a door opens when someone has finally found the right key. "I don't know yet," he said, "but I intend to find out." The garden held its breath around them, and the mist fell soft as a decision, and neither of them moved for a long time after that. The third day arrived clear. The rain had scrubbed the sky overnight and left it the deep, washed blue of early autumn, the kind of sky that made the stone towers of Ballroom look sharper than usual, their edges precise against the light. The courtyard filled early with the sounds of horses being readied, trunks being loaded onto carts, and the particular organized noise of a castle preparing to return visiting lords to their own territories. The Alliance Council was ending. Lily knew what that meant. She had known since the night before, standing in the misty garden with the king's last words, still settling somewhere in her chest, like stones finding the bottom of still water. 3 days. That had been the arrangement. 3 days, and then a message to Boren, and then the road back to Ashfen, and the small house, and Senna's cold tea, and the ordinary weight of ordinary life. She rose before dawn, and went to the kitchen. If this was her last morning here, she intended it to mean something. She worked alone for the first hour, in the particular silence that only exists between night and day, the fire crackling in the great hearth, the stock she had set overnight filling the kitchen with a warmth that pushed back against the autumn chill seeping through the stone. She made a breakfast that was neither simple nor showy, honeyed oat porridge with dried summer fruit and toasted seeds, accompanied by fresh bread she had set to rise the night before, and a pot of herb tea blended from the garden's rosemary and the dried chamomile she had found in the back of the larder. Dusty and forgotten and still, she discovered with relief, fragrant. She was plating the last of the bread when Gareth appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was dressed for the road, which surprised her. She had not known he would be leaving with the other lords. "He's not sending me away," Gareth said, reading her expression with the ease of someone who read expressions professionally. "I'm riding out with Kale's escort to the Western Fork and coming back by noon. Xander's orders. Something about wanting to review the Stone March border agreement without Kale in the room to argue about it." Lily returned to her bread. "I see." "He does that," Gareth said, stepping into the kitchen and leaning against the doorframe with the comfortable posture of a man who treated every room as though he had been given permanent permission to occupy it. "Sends me out for a few hours when he needs to think about something that isn't strategy." She did not ask what he meant. She focused on the bread. "You're leaving today," Gareth said. It was not a question. "The 3 days are concluded." He could extend it again. "He could," she agreed carefully. "But I have not been asked." Gareth was quiet for a moment, which was, she was beginning to understand, unusual enough to mean something. "For what it's worth," he said at last, "I have ridden with that man through 4 border wars, 2 succession disputes, and 1 genuinely terrible winter in the Northern Pass, where we ate nothing but dried meat and questionable snow for 19 days. He paused. "I have never seen him eat an entire meal until you cooked one. I have never seen him go to the garden twice in the same number of days. And I have certainly never seen him tell someone they were not what he expected and mean it as the highest thing he knew how to say." Lily looked at him. Gareth shrugged with the practiced ease of a man communicating something important, while maintaining complete deniability about having communicated anything at all. "Enjoy the morning," he said, and left. The lords departed after breakfast. Lily watched from the kitchen courtyard as Lord Kale's party rode out through the main gate, banners of the Silver Raven catching the early light, horses steaming faintly in the cold air. Lord Edric had already gone at first light, apparently unable to wait through even a formal farewell. The castle exhaled around their departure, shoulders dropping, voices loosening, the particular relief of a household returning to its own rhythms after days of heightened performance. She went back inside and began cleaning the kitchen. She worked methodically, the way she did everything. Each pot scrubbed and stacked, each surface cleared, the larder reorganized back to its original order, with notes left for Dora about which provisions were running low, and which of the dried herbs needed to be replaced before winter. She did not need to leave notes. It was not her kitchen. But she left them anyway, because it felt wrong to leave a place without at least trying to make it easier for whoever came after. She was tying her cloak when Dora came in. The older woman looked at the notes Lily had left on the larder shelf, read them in silence, and then looked at Lily with an expression that was trying very hard to be professional and not quite succeeding. "You didn't have to do that," Dora said. "I know," Lily replied. Dora pressed her lips together, nodded once with the brisk efficiency of someone refusing to be sentimental about something they were being sentimental about, and left. Lily picked up her basket, the small knife, the cloth of remaining herbs. She walked up from the kitchen through the servants' corridor, through the eastern passage, and out into the south courtyard where the garden wall caught the morning sun and held it in a golden strip along the stone. She had not planned to go to the garden. She was heading for the main gate. She went to the garden anyway. It was brighter in the morning light than it had been in the rain or the evening mist, the rosemary rose sharp and silver green, the thyme low and dense between the stones. A fig tree she hadn't noticed before growing against the south wall with the last of its autumn fruit still clinging to the branches. She stood in the entrance for a moment, simply looking at it, committing it to the kind of memory that lives in the body rather than the mind. "You're leaving." She turned. Xander stood at the other end of the garden path. He was not in full armor today. The crossed leather straps were there, the wrist guards, but no fur mantle, and his braids were looser than usual, as though the morning had caught him before he had fully assembled himself into the king. He looked, she thought, slightly more like a man and slightly less like a monument. It was somehow more unsettling. "The 3 days are concluded, my king," she said. "I know how long 3 days is." He walked toward her slowly, stopping at the same distance as always, close enough for conversation, far enough for the pretense of formality to technically still exist. "The surveyor," he said. "I sent the order this morning. He rides to Ashfen within the fortnight. The village will be grateful. I am not doing it for the village's gratitude." She held his gaze. "I know." He looked at her for a long moment with that blue attention that she had spent 3 days learning the weight of. "I made you a promise," he said, without using those words. "In this garden, 2 nights ago." "You said you intended to find out," she said carefully. "What I am?" "Yes." "That is not technically a promise." "No," he agreed. "It is something more binding than a promise. It is an intention, and I do not form intentions lightly or abandon them for convenience." The garden was very still. The fig tree held its last fruit without dropping it. Somewhere above the wall, a raven settled on the stone and regarded them both with the impartial interest of a creature that has witnessed many things and formed opinions about none of them. "Lily," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without a title before it or a question after it, just the name itself, set down in the air between them like something placed with care on a surface that mattered. She waited. "Stay," he said. "Not for 3 days. Not as a cook summoned from a village to cover for an absent servant." He paused, and she saw in his face the particular effort of a man who does not speak easily about things that matter to him, choosing the words with the same seriousness she gave to flavors. "Stay because this castle has needed something for a long time that I did not have a name for until 3 days ago. And because you see things that should be seen and say things that should be said, and because every morning since you arrived, I have woken and thought about what you would cook that day before I thought about anything else. And I am not a man who wastes his first thoughts on things that do not matter." The words settled around her like the mist had settled 2 nights before, soft and total, covering everything. She thought about Ashfen, the dry summers, the small house with the debt that Boren had promised to clear, Senna, who would listen to all of this with enormous eyes and then say something practical and devastating, the kitchen in the inn that smelled of old grease and wood smoke, and the specific exhaustion of cooking for people who ate without tasting. She thought about this kitchen, this garden, the way the castle had felt these 3 days, like a language she had always known but never had occasion to speak. She looked at Xander, really looked at him, the way she looked at an ingredient she was trying to understand, and saw a man who was powerful enough to command and honest enough not to perform, who carried old grief in the line of his jaw and new attention in his eyes, who had said it is not an offer, it is a decision about a kitchen arrangement and meant it as practicality, but who now stood in a garden and said stay, and meant it as something else entirely. "I would need to send word to Senna," she said. "My friend in Ashfen. She will worry if I simply disappear." Something in Xander's face changed. The slight, careful shift of a man who has asked a question that mattered and received an answer that told him yes before the yes arrived. "A rider can leave within the hour," he said, "and Boren will be insufferable about it for years." "Boren," said Xander, with the calm of a man addressing a genuinely minor obstacle, "can be compensated for the inconvenience." She almost smiled. "You cannot simply compensate every complication, my king." "I can try," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in a way she had not seen it move before. Not quite a smile, but the possibility of one, close to the surface. "Then yes," she said. "I will stay." The word moved through Valdremore's castle quietly, the way true things tend to move. Not announced, not proclaimed, but simply known. The kitchen boys told the stable hands. The stable hands told the guards at the gate. Dora reorganized the east corridor room into something more permanent without being asked, adding a second wool blanket and a proper writing table and a window box where, come spring, herbs could be grown from the castle's own garden seeds. Gareth returned from the Western Fork at noon, was told by 3 separate people before he reached the main hall. and said nothing except, to no one in particular, with great satisfaction, "Good." Senna arrived from Ashfin 12 days later, having apparently decided that a letter was insufficient, and that she needed to see this castle and this king with her own eyes before she was prepared to form a settled opinion. She was small, dark-haired, and direct in the way of people who have spent years being the practical one, and she walked into the castle kitchen, looked at Lily working at the central hearth with the ease of someone who had always belonged there, looked at the organized larder and the fresh herbs drying from the ceiling beams and the notes in Lily's handwriting on the shelf, and said, "All right. I see." She stayed for a week. She spent 3 of those days in pointed conversation with Gareth, which neither of them discussed afterward, but which seemed to leave both of them in unusually good spirits. On the night of the first snowfall of winter, Xander came to the kitchen, not to summon her, not to request anything. He simply came, the way he had come to the garden, because the kitchen was where she was, and he had stopped pretending that was not reason enough. He sat on the bench near the far hearth, watching her work, and she cooked without performing, moving through the space the way she always moved through it, unhurried, precise, quietly attentive to every pot and every flame. She made him something simple that night, a broth of winter roots and barley, bread still warm from the oven, butter with rosemary from the garden worked into it by hand. The same kind of meal she had made in Ashfan on cold evenings for no one in particular, because the work itself helped her think. He ate all of it. Afterward, they sat near the fire in a silence that had nothing restless in it, the kind of silence that exists between people who have found, without ceremony or announcement, that they do not need to fill the space between them to make it feel full. Outside, the snow covered the courtyard and the garden wall and the last of the fig tree's leaves, and Valdremore's banners went still in the windless cold, and the castle settled into winter the way it had settled into winter for 100 years before. Stone and fire and the particular endurance of things built to last. In the spring, when the surveyor's report came back from Ashfin, and Xander rode out personally to oversee the relief provisions sent to the village, grain stores, seed stock, a new well dug at the eastern edge, the people of Ashfin stood in the road and watched their king ride through, and several of them noticed that he sat differently in the saddle than the stories said he used to, less like a man braced for the next threat, more like a man who had something to come home to. They were right. Borin, for his part, complained about losing his best cook for exactly as long as it took him to receive the king's compensation, which was generous enough that he hired 2 replacements and renovated the inn's hearthroom besides. He complained a little after that too, but without conviction, and anyone who knew Borin understood that this meant he was satisfied. Senna eventually settled in Valdremore, in a cottage near the east wall that Gareth helped her find, and then helped her repair, and then began spending a great deal of time near, for reasons he continued to describe as logistical. And Lily, who had arrived through the servant's entrance with a broth stain on her wrist, and 3 months of rent she couldn't pay, and herbs she grew herself because she couldn't afford to buy them, became the kind of presence in Valdremore's castle that castles rarely find and never forget. Not a decoration, not a title, but something more essential than either. The person who understood that a good meal does not fill you. It reminds you that you are alive. Xander never left. He had known, somewhere in the part of him that assessed things honestly even when honesty was inconvenient, that he would not from the moment he set down his spoon after the first bowl of broth, and thought, with the clear and disorienting certainty of a man who has just recognized something he had been missing for years, that whoever made this understood something true about the world. He had been right. He usually was, about things that mattered, but he had never been more glad of it than now.